Today, we're getting into the trumpets that we really didn't get into last time. We just introduced them a bit in chapter 8 of Revelation, you'll remember. But just a quick review. Remember, the book of Revelation is called the Revelation of Jesus Christ. So, we don't have to read any farther in the book to recognize that the central focus of what we learn in Revelation should be about Christ. And so we're not just interested in history, even though there is history in the book, history in the fact that it was prophesied and then it's happened in our day. So it was prophecy when it was written, it has become history in our day. Fulfilled prophecy, we might say. You remember in the first chapter we saw the vision of Jesus Christ, and we saw how in that vision there are characteristics of Christ that fit our every need, our every circumstance as his people. We went on from there after we found out, we left the churches. Remember, the last church was in a church judgment kind of condition, indicted. And we saw the judgment scene there in heaven and the seven sealed scroll, and we saw that John was weeping because nobody could be found to open the scroll. But then someone said, the Lion of tribe of Judah can do that. And so John begins to dry his tears and looks towards the throne, and what did he see? He didn't see the lion. There's the lion. He saw the lamb. Remember? The lamb slain from the foundation of the world. The lamb as it was slain right there. And you remember, of course, then we went from there into the seals and the opening of those seals. And in chapter 6, we went through the opening of the first 6 seals. I would like to remind you that as we looked at the churches, we saw a gradual, sometimes not so gradual, decline in spirituality and in truth in the church. As we looked at the seals, we went from the triumphant white horse. What was next? The red horse. And then what was after the red horse? Remember, the red horse was the persecution period. And then the black horse. And then finally the deathly pale horse. You notice a similar theme of declining life and spirituality. Now, because there are so many parallels between the trumpets that we're looking at today and the plagues in chapter 16, some people have tried to take the trumpets and put them up and make them future still. But I would just want to tell you some reasons why I still make it historical. One of the big reasons is it's in the wrong part of the book to be talking about just the end times. Revelation has a very unique structure, a very special structure. And one of the characteristics of that structure is what's called a chiasm. And so if you were to study that structure and figure it out, you'll know that it just wouldn't quite fit to have that kind of a jump. And another reason is that as we look at the trumpets, I believe that what we see are some things that happen in kind of a partial way that will have a fuller development and a fuller realization in the time of the plagues at the end of time. It reminds me a bit of the fact when we study the Old Testament church and we study about who the Israel of God is in the Old Testament all the way up to the time of Christ and just up until 34 AD. We are studying about a very kind of small geographical area of the world, aren't we? We're studying about Israel. We're studying about the Israelites, the descendants of Abraham, literally. But as we look at the New Testament application of Israel and the application of Israel up into the coming of Jesus, from Jesus' time up until his second advent, we see a total change. We see now the message going to all the world, every nation, kindred, tongue, and people, Remember, Jesus said, go first to Jerusalem, then to Judea, then Samaria, and then the uttermost parts of the world. And when we look at all these things that used to have a very small application, geographically at least, and we look at them in our day, they have worldwide applications, universal applications, we might say. I believe there's a similar relationship between the trumpets and the plagues. All right? So, I've looked at a whole lot of commentators on the trumpets. And even among Adventist commentators, there's some disagreement exactly how they should be applied. So I'm going to give you my conviction today. And as I've looked, though there are some that have shared some things that are interesting, I still think in our church one of the more accurate books about what happens with the trumpets is rather an old book called Thoughts on Daniel and the Revelation. Have you ever heard of that book? This one that I have was published in 1885, I believe. But as I read it, it was first entered by an act of Congress in the year 1881 by Uriah Smith. And I would submit to you that though it's not flawless and it has some things that we could add to or understand in a better way yet because of things that have transpired since that day, that generally speaking, the way he applies the trumpets is pretty good. And I believe that when God was developing the Advent movement there in the mid to late 19th century, that he was giving a real special blessing to the pioneers of our church. In fact, some of what we're going to talk about today, I believe, helped to lay the groundwork for the conviction that the interpretation of the 2300-day prophecy relating to the events of 1844 actually had a firm biblical foundation. I'll mention that when we get there. So let's turn in our Bibles to chapter 8 of Revelation. And you'll remember last time we saw that it mentioned the seven angels with the seven trumpets in verse 2. But then it talked about another angel that came, and remember we were in the sanctuary scene, and the angel was offering incense, and then he took incense and coals from off the altar with incense, and he did what with the censer? Remember what he did with the censer? Hurled it to the earth. Remember that? Verse 5, the angel took the censer, filled it with fire of the altar, cast it into the earth, and there were voices and thunderings and lightnings and an earthquake. And the seven angels, which had the seven trumpets, prepared themselves to sound. What happens when these angels sound? I want to remind you that Bible prophecy doesn't usually talk about South America. Bible prophecy doesn't usually talk about North America, at least prior to the time when the earth opened its mouth to help the woman. We'll talk about that in Revelation 12. Revelation doesn't usually talk a lot about Australia or Antarctica in its prophecies. Why is that? Why does the Bible normally talk about the nations around the Mediterranean basin and not too far away? What's that? Well, it was the known world for the people writing this, true. But there were other people who knew about the rest of the world. But you're right. I mean, we usually think we call that, quotes, the civilized world. Although more and more we study, anthropologists are studying the ancient cultures of the world, and they find there were some that were quite highly civilized in other areas. Depending on what you call civilized, of course. Why is it that we deal with those areas in Bible prophecy? Well, that's right, because that's where God selected his people to take his message to the world. And prophecy deals with the people who have received the message of God and those who interact with them, and how that message is being carried forward and all the ins and outs of what's transpiring with God's message going to this world. All right? So I believe there's a reason then why the historical application that I choose to accept here fits. You remember in the days of ancient Israel, did they always do everything that the Lord wanted them to do? Were they always just totally faithful and only worshiped God? Wouldn't that be wonderful? Then all those glorious prophecies of Isaiah could have come to fruition. We know that there were many times that Israel did not follow God, and when she did not follow God, she finally left the protection of God and chose another God. Do you remember last time we talked about a text in Amos 5, verse 8? They chose new gods, and there was what? War in the gates. And I talked to you about that being a principle. When Israel chose other gods, you remember finally Israel, the northern part of Israel, went to Assyria, captive, and Judea went to Babylon as captives. Remember that? They finally had lost the protection of God, and God needed to get their attention to bring them back. Otherwise, there would be no one to carry on the message of God. Now, do you think that there has been any kind of unfaithfulness at all in the progression of Christianity from the time when Jesus and the apostles were here? Have there been any Christian, quotes, people who have begun to teach wrong doctrine? Have there been any who have begun to worship in other ways besides what God has said? Have there been any that have gone against some of the 10 commandments that God has given us about how to relate to Him, or some of the ones about how to relate to our fellow men? See, I believe that has happened. And as we look through the trumpets, we are going to see that as God's people begin to leave Him and choose other gods, choose other truths, other ways, they open themselves up. They have chosen new gods. And thus there is war in the gates. Remember, I mentioned there are only two choices we have. We either choose the true God of heaven, or what's the other option? The God of this world, or Satan, really, isn't it? Anything other than God, even though we're thinking we're following some philosopher or whatever, is really, if it's going against what God has revealed, we have chosen the God of this world, which is really Satan. And inasmuch as Christ's church has done that, they have opened themselves up to warfare and problems. We might say plagues. And so as these trumpets sound, they are calls to war, brought on by our unfaithfulness as God's people through the ages. The first angel sounded in verse 7, and there followed hail and fire mingled with blood, and they were cast upon the earth, and the third part of trees, and the third, I got a little mixed up. And the third part of trees was burnt up, and all green grass was burned up. Hail, fire, blood. What's happening here? What would bring on troubles like that upon this earth? As we followed in the churches and the seals, we saw this digression. As we get into the trumpets, we see we're already in a state of turmoil, aren't we? What was the period of time we saw in the churches and in the seals when we finally got to a place where God had to allow bad things to happen to His people? Weren't we getting very close just precursor days to the Dark Ages themselves. The apostasy that began to come into the Christian church began to reach its fullness by about the 4th, 5th century of our era. And so I believe when we look at the first trumpet, we're going to look at that time period when those who call themselves Christian or Christian nations begin to receive the effects of their unfaithfulness in following God. You remember in chapter 8, as we looked earlier in the chapter, we talked about the censer that was flung to the earth. We've often talked about the similarity between Revelation and Daniel. Revelation 8 seems to be letting us know that because of something to do with the censer being flung down to the ground, these trumpets are going to sound. Do you remember in Daniel, the 8th chapter, same chapter, but in Daniel, in verses 10, 11, 12, there was something that was flung to the ground, and it was trampled upon. Do you remember what that was? Do you remember the power that did it? As we review the prophecy of Daniel 7, remember we had those fierce beasts, and then we had a little horn power. What part of that prophecy of Daniel 7 would still be alive and around during the days after the book of Revelation was written? Well, we know Babylon is ancient history, right? We know Medo-Persia is ancient history. We know Greece is ancient history, not quite as ancient as the others. All right, so Rome was the only one still around, but by the time we get into the apostasy of God's people, we're actually having a transition from the fierce beast to that one power that rises up with the little horn. And it's to do with that power that we had the truth thrown to the ground. You remember? The truth was thrown to the ground. And along with the truth, there was something else that was thrown to the ground that he stamped on. We called it the Tamid when we talked in Daniel. Remember, that's the daily ministration of the sanctuary. What does the daily ministration of the sanctuary relate to? What did the lamb relate to that was sacrificed morning and evening? It was the ministry of Jesus, wasn't it, on our behalf? His sacrifice for us. What about the light in the sanctuary that was always lit on the 7-branch candlestick? Jesus, the light that lights every man that comes into the world. Remember? What about the table of showbread? Jesus said, I am the bread of life. What about the incense altar right before the curtain? The one that's so closely connected to Revelation 8. It's a part of the daily ministry, remember? Remember when John's father, Zacharias, was offering the incense on the altar and the people were outside praying? We're talking about the daily ministry of Christ on our behalf. So it seems that Revelation 8 is referring to the results of what happens when God's people quit trusting in the daily ministry of Christ for them. When his church begins to institute other things in place of Christ. When did that happen in the official Christian church? I want to do this very gently now, because I don't like calling names, but you have to say some things when you're talking of history. When was it that in the official Christian church, something was instituted in the place of the sacrifice of Christ? You know, it was the thing that really, I think, affected Martin Luther and caused him to have such a crisis in his life, when he recognized the idea that he was recreating Jesus and sacrificing Jesus afresh. I believe the institution of the Mass probably was like the climax of the rebellion against the daily and throwing the daily to the ground. When was the first Mass instituted? Closest I can come is 395 AD. 395 has another interesting event. It's the death of the Roman Emperor Theodosius, upon whose death the barbarian hordes that had been kind of held at bay upon his death in that same year, November 395, the first of the barbarian hordes began to come down and attack the Western Roman Empire. By the way, the Roman Empire was in three parts. You'll notice a lot of thirds, by the way, here in these trumpets. The Roman Empire had the northern part of the empire, which was the capital city was Rome, had the southern empire, which was northern Africa, and its major city was Carthage, and the eastern empire, whose major city was Constantinople. Remember, renamed from Byzantium to Constantinople for King or Emperor Constantine. So in 395, these hordes came down. And I want to read you just a little bit to give you a little description. I have brought a copy of that book I showed you a while ago, but one that I can use without worrying about damaging it so much. That old book by Uriah Smith. You know why I chose it? Because he went back to some really good sources, and my sources are in boxes over on the farm. And so, Cardinal Gibbons, remember, wrote the big 5-part series on the decline of the Roman Empire, the history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. And he often quotes him in here, so I'm quoting Gibbons on a secondary source here, trusting that Brother Smith got it right. This is on page 477 of his book with this particular edition. The Gothic nation was in arms at the first sound of the trumpet. Now, this is not a Christian historian writing this, by the way. This is Cardinal Gibbons. You recognize the title? Edward Gibbons? All right. The Gothic nation was in arms at the first sound of the trumpet, and in the uncommon severity of the winter, they rolled their ponderous wagons over the broad and icy back of the river. And it says, the fertile fields of Phocis and Boeotia were crowned with a deluge of barbarians. The males were massacred, the females and the cattle of the flaming villages were driven away. Down below, the whole territory of Attica was blasted. The most fortunate of the inhabitants of Corinth, Argos, and Sparta were saved by death from beholding the conflagration of their cities. In a season of such extreme heat that the beds of the rivers were dry, Alaric invaded the dominion of the west. The secluded old man of Verona pathetically lamented the fate of his contemporary trees, which must blaze in the conflagration of the whole country. And the emperor of the Romans fled before the king of the Goths. And there's a little note added by Brother Smith. He says, note the words of the prophecy, the third part of the trees was burned up. It seems there were some historical events that actually follow the descriptions of Trumpet 1, Trumpet 2, Trumpet 3. I won't have time to get into all those today. I would commend to you this little book that will give you a detailed account of it. He goes from the first trumpet being Alaric the Goth to the second trumpet. You remember where the second trumpet, let's read the second trumpet before we mention it. A great mountain. The second angel sounded, as it were, a great mountain burning with fire was cast into the sea, and the third part of the sea became blood. Well, the next great invasion of the Roman Empire came from the south, from Carthage area, and, excuse me, you'll notice the emphasis on the sea and the mountain burning with fire. Oh, let's see, I have to read a little bit here. The fleet, well, it describes a battle that took place at Carthage where the ships were just all ablaze. It describes that this particular, the Vandals, were seafaring, were naval, and that they came in, that Rome was under threat for like 40 years from the sea. And finally, when Rome fell under the Vandals, you remember what Vandals are known for, by the way? Any of you young people heard the term vandalism? They're the ones that gave it that name. So that gives you a little insight. Genseric was the one who took Rome, and it was like a great mountain falling into the sea. The third part of the creatures that were in the sea had life died. The third part of the ships were destroyed. Notice all the naval references. The third angel sounded, and a great star fell from heaven, burning as it were a lamp, and it fell upon the third part of the rivers. Most people see in that the third barbaric attack upon the empire. Attila the Hun, remember? And he used to boast, according to the historians, that wherever his horse trod, the grass didn't grow anymore. And so we have these historical, I believe, confirmations that the Bible knew what was going to happen. He was known as the scourge of God, and he willingly accepted the title. But he also, though he came like a meteor upon the scene, he ceased very suddenly because he had some kind of a convulsion and died. The fourth trumpet. The fourth angel sounded, the third part of the sun was smitten, the third part of the moon, the third part of the stars. And most see in this the final attack upon the Western Empire during the days of, is it Romulus? Augustulus, there you go. He had a name that actually was a diminutive form of Augustus. It meant the little one, the little Augustus. He was the last Roman emperor. So as the barbarian tribes continued to attack, finally the last Roman emperor fell. And in the year following, the Senate and the consul both were disbanded. And most see in that the sun and the moon and the stars that were darkened, those leaders of the Roman Empire. So in essence, in short, the first four trumpets seem to describe the downfall of the Western Roman Empire, whose center was Rome. Why would the Bible talk about attacks upon that particular part of the world? I believe they chose new gods. No longer were they relying upon the intercession of Jesus. They were relying upon a particular ritual. No longer were they relying upon talking directly to God through the name of Christ, but they were relying on the intercession of saints and martyrs and angels. Get the picture? And when we finally leave God out of the picture and don't follow his word, we then open ourselves up to the one who leads us to war and destruction and problems. What about the three woes? I intended to do that today, but I can see that the time has gone way past me. We're going to see the rest of the fall in the three woes. You'll notice that the trumpets are divided into a 4 and a 3. We saw earlier that the seals were divided into a 4 and a 3. And so, similar kinds of structure. What I want to point you to, for you to be thinking about between now and the time we deal with the woes, is the last verse. Let's see, the last verse of chapter 9, because we're going to look at chapter 9 on the woes. Jump ahead with me to verse 20. Just to give you the setting, all the four woes we just read about, the four trumpets, and the first two of the woes, the first 6 of all the trumpets, have just finished sounding. And this is the response of the people of the earth. Verse 20 of chapter 9, the rest of the men which were not killed by these plagues, yet repented not of the works of their hands, that they should worship devils and idols of gold and silver and brass and stone and of wood, which neither see nor hear nor walk. Neither repented they of their murders, nor of their sorceries, nor of their fornication, nor of their thefts. What do you see here? We see an unrepentant people in spite of all that God has allowed to happen. The trumpets are basically teaching us this, that when we choose another God, we are open to some very dangerous things. We now have chosen a leader who leads us to war and to hate and to destruction. Now, we could allow those things to bring us back to God and accept him and repent of our deeds and have a new start. But we're going to see that both the trumpets and then later on the plagues kind of uncover the attitude of those who choose to remain on the wrong side. And the thing that we'll finally see at the very end, even at the destruction of the final in the lake of fire, we will see that all who have chosen to reject God never want to change. They are determined to go their way. And that's kind of a sad thing, isn't it? And yet for us it can be a good thing to know that that will happen, because we know that we still have the opportunity to choose God's way. We know that even should we be in the midst of all the conflict of this world, that if we commit to choosing God's way, he can keep us through it. You'll remember back there when we were looking at the seals, the fifth seal, we saw the martyrs under the altar crying out, "How long, O Lord?" And it reminds us that God's people sometimes have to be martyred. Sometimes we have to go through hard times. But it also reminds us that God notes that cry and that God is there with us through that experience. And so even if we go through some hard times, even like the things pictured by these trumpets, we can have God with us through it. And we don't have to have the attitude, "They repented not of their deeds." We know that in God we can have the one who is the Lamb that was slain from the foundation of the world on our side. We have the Lion of the tribe of Judah. We have the Son of Man who meets us in every need, even when we're in the darkness of persecution, even when we're in the midst of apostasy around us. We still have Christ meeting our needs. Next time, we will see the three woes, the first two in particular, which show really the downfall of Europe, or the Western Roman Empire, under the attacks of the Muslim peoples. It's an interesting time in history, but we don't have time to get into the details, so we'll talk about that next time. When I committed to do Revelation, I committed to do even these hard parts. And so I hope you can stick with me through it. It's been a blessing to be studying and finding out how God's word, I believe, has been confirmed by the events of history. Next time, I'm going to show you a time prophecy that was so exact that it helped to confirm the Advent people in their understanding of the 2300 days. If you want to go ahead and look at those, chapter 9, verse 10, chapter 9, verse 15, two time prophecies we'll look at.